it's Stella here from North Star Crochet, and today we're going to be learning a few simple ways of joining granny squares. So we're going to do about 4 different ways, 2 with a darning needle and 2 ways with the no-sew crochet method. So we're going to be using a crochet hook. So we are aiming to make this tote bag. So if you have got enough granny squares, then we're going to make this tote bag. So it's got 4 squares on the front, 4 squares on the back, and then 6 squares round the outside. Okay, so we're going to use 4 different joining methods to do that. Don't worry if you haven't got 14 granny squares. There are other little projects you can do, such as this nice little hold all, and you can join that a different way. So however many granny squares you've got, we are going to aim to do at least 4 different joins today to complete your projects. Okay, so without further ado, let's get on. So we're going to start with the first side of the tote bag, and we're going to show you the whip stitch. So if you get 4 granny squares, obviously if you haven't got the amount for the tote bag, I'll tell you how many granny squares you need, but you obviously need at least 2 sides to be able to join 2 together. The way I tend to join it is horizontally first, so I'll go all the way across however many rows that I need. So for this one it's just 2 rows, so I'll be going across 2 lots horizontally, and then I will be coming down vertically. Okay, so you've got your 4 granny squares. We are going to have them from the good side facing upwards. So as you look down on it, you'll see the last row of your V's tend to be facing towards you, and there's a slight ridge, and it's the better quality side that's facing you. If you look at it on the back side, it's the rougher side, and the V's tend to be falling away from you. So it's the good side facing up that we'll be doing it. And as I say, I'll be joining these 2 first, and then I'll be bringing these 2 in. Okay, so we can join it flat towards on the table, or we can bring it together and join it that way. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to bring it a little bit closer so you can see it a bit better, and we'll start with the first 2 by doing the whip stitch. Before I do that, what I want to show you is I'll do it with different coloured yarn, basically so you can see the stitches. However, if you did it with the same coloured yarn, even though this isn't an invisible stitch, it kind of blends in, so you can't really see the stitches, but I'll use a different colour so you can see the difference. So to go the full length of that, I am going to use 3 times the yarn. That is plenty to join it together with the whip stitch. So I'm using 3 times the length, and this just gives me extra tail length just so I can weave in my ends and secure the ends better. And just so I don't run out of yarn. There's nothing worse than being halfway through a project and you've run out of yarn. So yeah, 3 times the length. Get your darning needle and you're good to go. The other tip that I can suggest is if you don't want these squares to move around, then you can use your stitch markers and just join them together so they're not moving about as much. The other reason to use stitch markers is if you're using different colours and you want your squares to be in a certain order, then it just keeps them in order and they're not falling about all over the place. But for this example, I'm not going to use them for now, and we're going to start with our first 2 granny squares. Okay, so we're going to start with the bottom granny square and then work into the top granny square. And we're going to start in the top right hand corner. If you're left-handed, you're obviously going to start in the top left hand corner, but it's the same sort of stitching. Okay, so in your corner space you should have 2 chains. So if you have a look there, you've got 2 chains. So you've got a V there, which is your first chain, and a V there, which is your second chain. The first chain, so the front and the back loop of your first chain, belong to the top row. The side chain belongs to the side row, so we're not going to be using that one. So the first chain there that belongs to the top row, I'm going to be going into the back loop only. So that's the front loop there, and that would be the back loop. Now before you start, I'm going to use the back loop for a few stitches, and then I'm going to show you how to use both loops on the whip stitch. I would recommend that if you start with the back loop, then you just continue all the way through your work doing the back loop only, because the stitch sizes are slightly different sizes. If you start with the both loops, then in that corner space you would be picking up the front loop and the back loop, but make sure you've got the bum of the stitch there. You're not going through your corner space, you're going through the front and the back loop of that chain stitch in the corner, and you've got your bum stitch on the back. Okay, but for this purpose I'm using the back loop only first of all, and then in your top granny square, again in the corner space, you've got your 2 chain. You've got 1 chain there and 1 chain there. The second chain belongs to the side, so we're not going into that. This top chain here belongs to this top row, so we'll be using that. You've got your back stitch there, and you've got your front stitch there. It's kind of the reverse on the top. All you've got to think about is the good side that's facing upwards. The top is always going to be your front loop, and the bottom is always going to be your back loop. Okay, so we've gone in the back loop of your bottom granny square. We're now going to come up through the bottom, out through the top of the bottom loop. Tops and bottoms, there's so many in there. Right, and we're just going to pull that through, and we're going to leave a fair sized tail end. But if you want to secure this even more, if you fear that going through and pulling it you might lose this tail end because it's not anchored at all, then what you can do is just tie this in a knot like so, so that tail end isn't going to move anywhere, and then you can weave that in later on. Okay, so now we've joined the bottom and the top granny squares together in that corner chain. We're now going to move on to your next stitch, which is your first double crochet of this row. So you should have 3 double crochets in each of those granny square segments. So the first stitch, you can see the V's on the top, so that will be your front loop there, and that will be your back loop there. So we're going to be going into the back loop only, and then on your top granny square you've got your back loop there and your front loop there. So we're just going to be working into the back loop only, and this is just to show you the difference in sizes. So if you are working through both loops, continue to work through both loops. And then we're going to pull that tight, and then we're going to work into the next stitch. So again, your next stitch, you've got your front loop there and your back loop there. If you were working through both, you pick up both loops, but because we're going in the back loop only, we're picking up the back loop only. And then on your top granny square, you've got your back loop there, and we're going to pull it through. And you'll notice this whip stitch, it's kind of like a spiral effect. So it's just spiraling through, and you're going to continue down back loop only of the next stitch, pull it through, back loop, back loop, pull it through. I'll do one more, back loop, and pull it through. Now you can pull this, if you hold it there, your granny squares there, you can pull that tighter. Obviously that tail end, if you didn't anchor it and tie it in a knot, it'd pull through at this stage if you did that. But you can pull it tighter so the stitches go a little bit smaller, but as you can see, it's not an invisible stitch. You can still see the lines of this stitch using the whip stitch. If it was in the same colour, it would merge in, so you wouldn't be able to see it. That doesn't mean it's invisible, it just means that you've blended it in. Okay, but with a different colour you can see the stitches, and if you look on the back again, you've still got your stitches there. It will blend in more if you're using the same colour. Now what I'm going to do is show you what it looks like if you go through both loops. So again, we're using the same technique. You're always going to go in through the bottom granny square and come out the top granny square, and then whip it round, go in the bottom, out the top, whip it round. Okay, so your next stitch, we were going through the back loop only before. This time we're going to go through the front and the back loop. So we've gone through both loops. So we've got 2 loops on our needle. And then on the top granny square again, we're going to go through the back loop and the front loop. So we've got both loops on our hook, on our needle. And then we're pulling it through the same way as we did before. Whipping it round. Now we're going through both loops again, front and back. Both loops again of your next stitch, front and back. Pulling it through. Both loops of the bottom, both loops of your top granny square, and pulling it round. A couple more, so you're going through front and back loops, front and back loops of the top granny square, pulling it through. Do one more of them. So you've got your front and back loop, your front and back loop, and you're pulling it through. Now again, you can pull it a little bit tight, just hold both your granny squares there, pull it a little bit tighter. You can't pull it as tight, but you will notice it will sort of be longer stitches if you're going through both. So that was your slip stitch, your back loop only, tend to be a bit smaller, and that is if you went through both loops, tends to be a little bit bigger even if you pull it tight. Not much difference, you can't pull it as tight if you're going through both loops down the middle, but there is a little bit of a difference. Smaller in the back loops only, a bit longer if you're going through both. Okay, so I'm going to revert back to the back loops only for the rest of this. So again, that's your front loop, and then that will be your back loop of the bottom granny square, and then your next one, that's your back loop there, which is nearest the table, and the top stitch, which is the top of your good side, is your front loop. So I'm going to go into the back loop only. Oop. Might help if I attach my yarn again because it's fallen off. There we go. Let's try that one again. So back loop only, and pull it through. Back loop, and pull it through. We're then back in the corner space, so we've done all our stitches and we're now into the chain. So we've got one chain there and one chain there. That top chain there belongs to the top row, this chain here belongs to the side row, so we're ignoring that one. So we're just doing the chain stitch there, and we're going into the back loop only. We're then in that corner, we're going to pick up this chain, this first chain, and we're going to go into the back loop only of that chain, and we're going to pull it round, pull it tight. There we go. Now what we're going to do is we're going to bring in our other two, and we're basically going to work it in the same way that we did this first one. So you've got your corner space, your side chain belongs to the side, the top chain belongs to the top. You're going to go in the back loop only. So that's the side chain, that's the top chain. You've got your front loop and your back loop. So it's the back loop only. And then you're going to pick up your other granny square. Let's get it the right way. There. Into the corner space. Those are your two chains. So you're going to pick up the back loop only. And you're going to pull it tight. And that's joining them two together. And then you're going to carry on the same way by going in the back loop only of your next stitch, the back loop only of your next stitch on the top granny square, and then pulling that tight, making sure they're still joined together, and then the back loop only, so that's the front loop there, that's the back loop, pull it tight, back loop, and you're going to continue that way all the way down, and I'll meet you back in the corner to show what you do there. Okay, so we've reached the corner. I've not gone into the chain stitches yet at the corner, but I just wanted to show you again the difference. So you can see at the beginning we started just doing the back loops only, and then we went through both loops, and then we reverted back to the back loops only. So you can sort of see better now the difference in the size of the stitches if you went through the front loop, the back loops only, compared to going through both loops. So choose the one that's right for you, choose the one that's easiest for you, but just know the difference between going through the back loops only and going through the both loops. So now we've got to this last stitch, so we've got the two chain stitches here. So you've got your first chain, so the front loop and the back loop that belongs to your top row, and then this chain, front loop and back loop, that belongs to the side row. So we're just concentrating on the chain that belongs to the top row. We're going into the back loop only and the back loop only of the chain on your top granny square. You're going to pull it through, and then we're going to weave in. So if I turn it over to your bad side, that's where we're always going to weave in. So that's what it looks on the other side as well, the wrong side. But seeing as this is going to be the inside of your bag, it doesn't really matter. So we've turned it over, and now we're just going to weave it in. So I'm going to go into that first stitch, pull it through, and I'm just going to put my needle through that loop and just make a little bit of a knot with it, so it's not going to come unravelled. Okay, and then we're going to continue weaving through the stitches just on this side. You don't want to go through to the other side. Weave through the stitches. And then come back again. and then we can just cut the end off. Okay, so that's the wrong side, and then that is your right side, and you can weave this end in as well. Okay, now you're going to do the same down vertically. So you can turn it round again, so you're just going horizontally again if you wanted to, and you're just doing it the same way if you're using the whip stitch again. Okay, so one side of your bag we're going to use the whip stitch, but if you want to try the invisible stitch, if you've got less squares, then we're going to do the invisible stitch going down now. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to do the invisible stitch. So that was the back, this is the front. We've already done down that way with the whip stitch. I'm then turning it round and I'm going to do the invisible stitch down this way. Okay, so again, I'm going to use about 3 times the width, 3 times the width, just a little bit extra. We're going to thread the needle, and again we're going to start in the bottom granny square, and we're going to start in the top right hand corner. Okay, if you're left-handed, obviously you're going to start in the top left hand corner. Okay, so this granny square, bit of an odd one because yeah, we have got 1 chain in the corner, so I'm just going to try and pretend that that chain there is the chain that belongs to the top row. Okay, so that's your 3 stitches and that's your corner space. Okay, so you had your chain here, and that would be your side chain. Okay, so you've got your 2 chains there that make up the corner space. So in this particular one, on the invisible stitch, we're going to go in the back loops only. So I'm going to go in the back loop only. I'll bring it closer to you. So you've got your 2 corner stitches, you're going to be using both of those. So we're going to go in the back loop only of the side chain, and then we're going to rotate our needle and we're going to come up through the back loop only of that first chain that belongs to the top. Okay, so again, the corner space there, you've got your 2 chains. 1 chain belongs to the side, 1 chain belongs to the top. We're going to go into the back loop only, so that's the front loop, and that's the back loop of the chain that belongs to the side. We're then going to rotate our needle and come in from the back and just go through the back loop only, leaving the front loop, and we're going to bring that through, leave a little bit of a tail. Okay, and then we're going to do the same again just to make a little bit of a knot. So we're going to go in through the back loop only of that chain, and then rotate our needle, and we're going to come in through the back loop only of that chain that belongs to the top row, and then just pull that tight. Okay, we're then going to move up to our top granny square. We're going to find those 2 chains again in the corner. So we've got 1 chain there, which is a V, and 1 chain there. Okay, and again what we're going to do is we're going to go into the back loop only. Bring it a bit closer to you. So you've got your chain there and your chain there in the corner. We're going to go in from the top through the back loop only. That will be the front loop. That's the front loop. That's the back loop. So we're going to go in through the back loop. We're going to rotate our needle and we're going to come up through the back loop of the next stitch. Okay, and pull that through. So we're there. Okay, so that's our first stitch on the top square. We're going to do alternate, so we're going to do a stitch on the bottom, then a stitch on the top, a stitch on the bottom, a stitch on the top, a stitch on the bottom, and we're going to continue like that. So our last stitch was on the top, so now we're going to move back down to our bottom stitch. Okay, you don't have to tighten it up at this stage yet. So the next stitch is we're going to go in the same stitch, so in the back loop where we came out of the first stitch. So in that back loop that we've used before, we're going to go in that, and then we're going to come up the back loop of our first stitch and pull that through. Again, at this stage we don't have to pull our stitches tight, it's fine. Okay, and then we're going to go back up to our top granny square and we're going to go into the same stitch that we used before. So where that's coming out there, that's the stitch there. We're going to go into the back loop of that stitch and then we're going to come out of the back loop of your next stitch. Okay, and it kind of forms an X, if you will, on your needle, but in through the back stitch, turn your needle and then out through the back stitch of your next crochet stitch there, and then pull that, and then again we're going to go down to the bottom square again, and again where we came out of last time, we're going to go in through that back loop where we came out of last time, and then your next stitch we're going to come out through the back loop of that next stitch. Okay, and that's your next two stitches. So we're going to go in through the back loop where our last stitch was, so in through the back loop, and then turn your needle up, and we're going to come in from the bottom out through the top of that bottom back stitch there. As you can see, it kind of forms an X on your needle. Then we're going to go back down to the bottom one again. So you can see that was the back stitch of your last one where it came out. So the back stitch, you're going into that, twisting your needle round and coming up from the bottom out through the back stitch of your next one. So that's the front loop there, that's the back loop. And you're going to continue that all the way down. So again, in through the back of the first stitch and then out through the back loop of the next stitch. In through the last back loop and then out through the next back loop. And you're just doing alternate like that. So the last stitch was in the bottom, so now we're going back to the top where your last stitch was, where you came out of your back loop. You're going to go in back in the back loop only again, and then you're going to turn your needle and come back out of your next back loop of the next stitch. Back to the bottom square. You've got your 2 stitches there. You're going to go back in through that same stitch that you've used previously. Twist your needle and come back up through the back loop of your next stitch. Back to the top again. You've got your 2 stitches there, one that you've used previously, and your next stitch. So you're going to go into the back loop only. You're going to twist your needle up and come back up through the back loop only of the next stitch. Back to the bottom, and again in the same stitch that you've used before, you've got your 2 stitches there, you've got your front loop and your back loop. So you're going to go into the back loop only, and then you're going to turn your needle and you're going to come back up through the back loop only, not the front loop, of your next stitch. And then what happens when you pull it tight, hold on to your granny squares at the side like we did before, and you're just going to pull your stitch, and you can see that is the invisible stitch. I've used a completely different colour. You can see the colour going down the centre there in grey, and you cannot see the colour unless you pull it apart. You can just about see it, and on the back you can just about see it on the back, but again that is going to be inside your bag, so you're not going to see it fully, but you can see there it's a completely different colour and you can't see it. So we're going to continue down. So we did the bottom one first, so we're going back up to the top. We're going to find the last stitch that you went into, which is that one there. So you're going to go in the back loop only, and then in your next stitch come up through the back loop only and pull it, and then back down to the bottom in the same stitch that you've used before, back loop only, and up through the next stitch, back loop only. I'm going to continue that till we get to the middle, and I'll show you what we're doing there. Okay, so I've got to the centre, the last stitch before we get to our chain stitches. Again, I've not pulled it tight, so I'm now going to pull it tight. So we're going to hold on to our granny squares there, and we're just going to pull that yarn, and the stitches disappear. Okay, so again, that is completely invisible compared to the whip stitch that we did. That is your invisible stitch. And we've done our last stitch. We've pulled it tight so you can't see the stitches anymore. So now what we're going to do, we did end up in the top granny square, so we're now going to move down to the bottom granny square, and we're going to go into our 2 chains in the corner. So we've got 1 chain there, and then the back loop of the other chain there. Okay, so we're going to go in through the back loop of the first chain, we're going to swizzle it round, and we're going to come out the back loop of the second chain and pull that tight. We're then going to go back to the top, and we're going to do the same thing again. So you've got your 2 chains, you've got the same stitch that you came in through, and then your top chain there, the back loop of your top chain. So that's the front loop of your top chain, that's the back loop of your top chain. So the stitch that you came into before, you're going to go in through the back loop, You're going to turn it round and you're going to come up through the back loop of that chain and you're going to pull it tight. You're then reverting back down to your bottom again. So you've got your side stitch that you've used before along the other row that you did using the whip stitch. So the back of your side stitch there, and then this is your top chain where you've got your front loop and your back loop of your top chain. So you're going to go into the back loop of the side chain and then turn your needle round and you're going to come up through the back loop of your next stitch, which is the chain stitch at the top, and then pull that through. And then you're going to go back to your top granny square again, and then the side stitch, the side chain in the corner, you've got the chain that you've used before at the side where you've been in during your whip stitch. Okay, so you're going to go into that, and then your other chain there, you've got your back loop there and your front loop there, and you're going to come up through that stitch. So you're going to go in through that first chain and then turn your needle and out through the back loop only of that second chain and pull that tight. Okay, and then you're going to come back down to the bottom granny square again, and again that chain stitch that you've used before, that you went into before, you're going to go in through the top through the back loop, twist your needle and come back out through the next stitch, back loop only. And again we're alternating now, back up to the top granny square, into the stitch that you previously used before, back loop only, twist your hook and then come up through the back loop only of your next stitch, back down to the bottom. Those are your two stitches, the stitch that you've used before, and then your next stitch, that's the front loop, that's the back loop. So you're going to go into the back loop only of the stitch that you've used before. You're going to turn your needle down and then come in from the bottom through to the top through that back loop only, and just keep doing that alternately all the way back down to the end, and I'll meet you at the end. Okay, so we're on our last stitch. I've not pulled it tight so you can just see where we are. So I'm going to hold on to my granny squares in the centre there. I'm going to grab hold of this working end and I'm just going to pull it until the stitches disappear. There we go. So you can see there, compared to the horizontal line of the whip stitch, that's the invisible stitch that we've done. Okay, I'll just do the final stitch on the side and then I'll show you what it looks like on the back side of the work. So we ended on the top granny square, so we're going to go into the bottom granny square next. We're going to go into that same back stitch that we used previously, and then we're going to come up through the back stitch of your first corner chain there, and then we're going to go to the top granny square. Remember, we're doing alternates, and the stitch that we last used there, you got your two stitches, you got the stitch that you last used and then your first chain on the side. So we're going to go into the back loop and out through the back loop of the first chain. Now if you were joining more granny squares, you'd just join more granny squares, but because this is going to be the end, I am going to go back down to the bottom granny square and I'm going to work into that side chain as well. So I'm going to go into, have a look, that was the last chain, the first chain which we came out of, and then that's the back end of the side chain. So I'm going to go into the back end of the first chain, rotate my needle and come up through the back end of the side chain, and I'm going to do the same in the top. So into the top, that's the top chain there, the V, and then that's the second chain which belongs to the side. So we're going to go into the back of the stitch, we're going to rotate it round and come out through the back of the side chain, and then just pull that tight, and then we're going to weave that end in. So that's what the front looks like, pretty invisible. Yeah, and then if you turn it round again, you can see it ever so slightly, the stitches at the back, but not as much as the whip stitch. Okay, so we're weaving this again into the back. I'm gonna just go through them two and just knot it. Go through them two, and then while you've got your little hoop, I'm going to put my needle through that, and I'm going to just tighten that up and then weave it through the back stitches.